and present our very distinguished speaker for today. So our session today will be focusing on Islamophobia. And of course, we'll be discussing that in light of the recent and ongoing current situation unfolding in Palestine. The speaker for today is Professor Bazian. He is a co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. In addition, Professor Bazian is a lecturer in the departments of Near Eastern and Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Bazian, between 2002 and 2007, also served as an adjunct professor of law at Bowlett Hall School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He teaches courses on Islamic law and society, Islam in America, communities and institutions, deconstructing Islamophobia and othering of Islam, religious studies, and Middle Eastern studies. Professor Bazian, welcome to our Kumi session.
Thank you for having me, and good morning for everyone that is participating. If I'm able to share my screen so I could at least begin with my slides to guide people through.
Yeah, I believe you're a co-host.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
So let me begin first by, when we speak about Islamophobia, it is not speaking about Islam per se, but the racialization and the targeting of Muslims as it relates to their religious/ethnic national identity. And in particular, Islamophobia became the Republicans' go-to theme to monetize Islamophobia into votes at the ballot box. And I would trace this to the beginning of the campaign for Obama, supposedly being a closet Muslim at the time, and using that as the framework to rally people into the ballot box, considering that the Republican Party is predominantly and overwhelmingly appeals to white Americans, Caucasians, and have not been able to make inroads to the increasing diversity in this country. If we think about the themes that the Republicans have been working with, it's really to undo the 1960s gains. The civil rights movement had three overarching gains: the Civil Rights Act itself, immigration rights reform, and the Voter Rights Act. So if we actually look at the Republican political strategy emerging from the 1960s till now, is how to undo these political gains. And the theme of taking our country back is not new. It's actually at the moment of the adoption of these three fundamental changes, we see a major shift, especially among Southern Democrats, into the fold of Republicans. And I would say the following: no Democratic candidate for the presidency since 1964 have won majority-wide vote in the presidential election. So no Democratic Party political figure from the 1964 up till today have won the majority-wide votes in presidential campaigns. So that shift, beginning with these three important development domestically for the United States, were paramount. Now, if we think about in the European context, France has been one of the major proponents or rewiring liberal democracies toward Islamophobia, using a variety of laws, including what they call neutrality of the state in matters of religion, using the claim of ostentatious display of religious symbolism, in particular targeting the mode of dress, governing the body and space of racialized minorities. And this phenomenon actually originates much earlier than this current period. It originates in the colonies, and now it's what we call the global colonial South within the colonial motherlands in the North. And if you think about the center of Paris versus the suburbs, in here the borders governed by those relationships. In the suburbs, it's really a colonial governance, while in the heartland of Paris, it's really, you would think of Paris as the center pole of this type of dynamic. Let's see, let's see if I could do this. Okay. Now, in other parts, especially in Switzerland, this is the campaign that has unleashed maybe some of the most in-your-face racism in attempt to try to regulate Islam Muslimness. And this is around the prohibition of the building of minarets, but also regulating the dress and outfit. And you could see the different color hands ripping Switzerland apart, kicking the black sheep out of Switzerland. And this was all really formulated around the Muslim subject, in particular using the women with the full cover. Interestingly enough, in Switzerland at the time, the number of women that were wearing the full body cover was actually very limited, in maybe 20 plus, maybe it could go up to 50. Most of the women that were actually dressed this were tourists that are coming from the Gulf for shopping, but it actually worked very well. The law that passed does not affect the tourists, but affects the Swiss Muslim women, which is the same in France. If you've been in France during the summer, a large number of men, women, and communities from the Gulf come to shop. They're not affected by the law. So as long as you spend your money on Louis Vuitton, you are welcome to dress as you see fit, walk with the Prada shoes while you full cover up. But if you happen to be a French Muslim, then we actually need to regulate how you dress and what you undertake. I argue that Islamophobia is a new signpost for overt racism, which I maintain created a new rationale for more intense violent racism toward African Americans, Latinos, and minorities in general. The campaign toward or anti-Muslim discourse began the campaign, and then later on created this notion that we are being victimized by the African Americans, the Black community, the Latino community, and we see it even intensify during the COVID against Asian Americans. As such, white Americans and white Europeans put themselves as being victims of this diversity that is taking our place, even though that every measure of criteria in terms of power, distribution of power, there is almost tangential shift on power dynamics within both the United States and Europe. If we think about the 500 large corporations in the United States, communities of color and women only have 4% CEOs of these 500 companies. And if you think about Congress, Senate, all the major seats, that's not the case. But the logic and the appeal actually works. Islamophobia was promoted through media and through material that really created some of the most horrific images for public consumption. And obsession, radical Islam's war against the West, is still one of the most expensive propaganda purchases for Islamophobia that was distributed to Americans during the 2008 election. 28 million copies of this documentary was distributed in the Sunday newspaper at a cost of $17 million. So when somebody is spending $17 million, we're not talking about somebody that does not have any money. By the way, if any one of you have $17 million, please talk to me after the lecture. I have a lot of good ideas for us of how to use it. But that was a single drop to try to influence election. And it became one of those pieces that many conversation in our local particular Republican club, local conversation that created what I call Islamophobic social imaginary and began to influence the public in this way. Now, when we define Islamophobia, I like to have two definition that we work with. One is the definition that I have, that we use at Berkeley. Islamophobia is a structural organizing tool deployed at the present racial crossroads and employed to rationalize and extend the dominant global North power alignment while embarking on a project for silencing the collective global other. So in this sense, looks at a continuity of colonial discourses and looking at it in a larger lens rather than only in the individual discomfort or implicit biases, which can be looked upon. Our colleagues in the UK, through their all-party parliamentary group, also use this definition. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness, meaning the outfit. For example, this past week, as people protested in DC and people went to the White House for protest, people were chanting Allahu Akbar, God is great. Among the right wing, they framed that saying Allahu Akbar is a call for violence, and this is a call for jihad. And that became the discourse among the right wing. So expressions of Muslimness, which saying God is great, greater than anything that we have, in essence, is problematized and used as a reference to terrorism. And then the second part of the definition in the UK, it also looks at how the Sikh community tend to become a primary target for perceived Muslimness. Post 9/11, the first person to be killed after 9/11 was a Sikh who was a gas station attendant in Arizona. And then the attack on the Sikh temple in Wisconsin under the perceived notion that these were Muslims. We don't want to accuse the racists to be able to distinguish the finer points between one culture or one tradition, but both Muslims and perceived Muslimness is a target. Also, there is the increasing phenomena of Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries, where a political, racial, social, economic, military, cultural, and religious process emerging out and shaped by the colonial Eurocentric hegemonic discourses dating to late 18th century, constituted and internalized through an imitative project by post-colonial elites, posited itself or was designated by Western powers as the custodian for the modern, secular, nationalist, and progressive Muslim nation-state project. And that, again, touches on why either the silence or total cooperation with Israel at this point, while it's unleashing massive violence. The political elites that are in the ruling seats in the Arab and Muslim world are predominantly post-colonial elites, trained, nurtured, developed, and protected by colonial or post-colonial powers, Europe and the United States. So it's not surprising to see the United States basically is conducting the war in Gaza, as Blinken is Israel foreign minister right now, rather than being Secretary of State of the United States. And all of the European states, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Canada are acting as almost advisors and moving their resources because they have formed these relationships with Arab and Muslim elites in the surrounding areas, and in essence, both protecting Western interests, oil, natural gas, and access to resources, and also affirming the centrality of Israel as a Western project from its inception. So that relates again to forms of Islamophobia in this. When we talk about the history of the term Islamophobia, it's actually originated in the French context, where the word appears, Islamophobie, back in 1910, and spoke of the French colonial context in parts of Africa. The French had a long colonial legacy and entanglement with Islamophobic discourse. And even for those who are familiar with Frantz Fanon's work, The Wretched of the Earth or Dying Colonialism, he wrote it in the context of the French colonial legacy in Algeria. And because he was sent as a psychiatrist from France, he was from Martinique, worked in France, then assigned to actually be a psychiatrist for tortured victims and the torturer who were torturing the Algerians. And in his process of actually dealing with both the victim and the victimizer, ended up leaving his medical appointment and joining the Algerian Liberation Front and became its spokesperson, and wrote The Wretched of the Earth as a way to really examine the entanglement and the relationship. So the French in Algeria, 132 years of colonial legacy, the number says about 8 million Algerians were killed by the French throughout the 132 years, 1.5 million in the first 3 years of the colonial entanglement, and then throughout. And then the last 2-3 years of the anti-colonial struggle, also killing about 1.5 million. The French tested nuclear weapons on Algerian landscape, and they still have not delivered the data and the information of where these nuclear tests were conducted. And adding part of this is that the French used to decapitate the heads of resistant fighters in Algeria and take their skulls to be exhibited and hosted in the Museum of Man. In 2017, a French, an Algerian researcher who was conducting work in France discovered that these skulls are still present in the storage of the French Museum of Man, and they repatriated, I think, 23 of these skulls, but there is many more that needs to be repatriated. So there's a long legacy of seeing Islam as a problem or as a DNA marker that needs to be addressed or solved. More recently, Edward Said brought the term back into circulation in writing in Covering Islam, which actually one of the early works on the problematization of Islam. Said exposes misperceptions of Islam and shows how partial media coverage usually finds what it wants rather than what is there. The three-part book looks first at coverage of revolutionary Iran, then at reporting about Islam in general, and finally discusses Middle East area studies in America and how Middle East studies really still, for the most part, maintains the paradigm of this problematic engagement with Islam and the Middle East. Important to say, not that is the significant identity marker. Edward Said is a Christian Palestinian and possibly is one of the foremost individuals to expose this construction of perception, demonization, as a way to rationalize policy. And his second work is Orientalism, and I think it's still a must read, where he speaks about latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism, building on Sigmund Freud, the subconscious and the conscious. And our conscious action is really built upon our subconscious that has been formed in our life for, throughout our history, and that begins to inform how we conduct ourselves in the same way that politics is really formed around the cultural nods and the cultural forms that gives us this certainty about places and people that we have not been with or saw or witnessed. And when it comes to the Middle East and the Muslim, I often say that across the popular discourse, they are deemed to be subhuman and people that are walking around with 3 eyes rather than regular human like us. And that makes it possible for us to witness the death and destruction visited on Gaza and not thinking that their lives matter. But more importantly, and this is actually the real, is that 1.5 million in Iraq died as a result of US policy, and we still have not accounted for them. And yet people actually today, they buy paintings that are being painted by George Bush, who taken on the hobby of paint, and nobody actually asked George Bush about the 1.5 million Iraqis and the destruction of the country. That is all rooted in our perceptions that has been infused through cultural forms that informs policy, and as such, rationalizes violence as a normal outcome. In relations to Islamophobia as part of public policy, the UK Islamophobia Challenge for Us All, a report by Rumi Trust in 1997, was one of the first to enter into the conversation of how Islamophobia affects and enters into public discourse. And in doing their report, they identified how Islamophobia produces prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, and violence. While much more, at least expansion of this have occurred since 1997, but I think at the root, it still functions in the way that it does. Prejudice in everyday conversation. We have done a polling wherein Muslims who work, let's say, in the tech industry, the mode of conversation immediately after the first or second comment immediately references and gets to be a discussion about terrorism or somebody's opinion about this and this, rather than thinking the person as a normal person. It's not the norm in what you call copy machine or water cooler conversation to go from how are you today, how's your coffee, to what do you think about Hamas or what do you think about this. It's not the norm. You know, you don't actually engage. What do you think of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol? Do your father or mother belong to a militia in Michigan or in this place? That's not the norm of the conversation. But for Muslims, that's the third question often is in that way. And I don't need to cover the media. I think it just, you could write many volume books about the atrocious coverage. Under normal conditions, maybe between 3 to 4 negative stories in the media about Islam and Muslims. In busy days and busy periods, it's all actually very negative. And I would like to point out to the Atlantic in particular. The Atlantic, up to maybe about a few days ago, wrote 40 articles on the Israel-Palestine, Israel attack on Gaza and the Israel-Gaza. 39 of it were written by pro-Israel Israelis, individuals sympathetic to Israel, 39. One article was written by a Palestinian who condemned the Palestinians. So you have literally 40-0 in terms of actually having anything representing a voice for Palestinians. And it's not surprising that at a policy level, this is the type of material that actually gets to be projected and announced. So for us, important to see this matrix as operable, and increasingly it's violence that actually is being articulated. On Sunday, we had a Syrian student at Stanford University being run over by a pro-Israel person in a car. He's in the hospital. And then immediately on October 11th, after the media went on non-stop about jihad and how it's an international day of jihad, a 70-year-old man who 3 weeks before built a tree house for this Palestinian 6-year-old kid and his mother, right, ended up going into the apartment and stabbing the 6-year-old 26 times and stabbing his mother, acting on the media that stoked this anger. And I would say both the media and President Biden are responsible for unleashing this violence in our society because of how they frame what is taking place and continue to do so. Islamophobia also is being funded. I talked about the funding of the documentary, and there are 6 sources of funding. One, the state. The government counter-terror apparatus is literally built upon the demonization of Muslims and created the infrastructure. Post 9/11, we could date it earlier from the Reagan administration and then also Clinton, the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that began this apparatus. But post 9/11, the government apparatus all were shaped around the Muslim threat, the Muslim subject. The FBI hired almost 14,000 new agents. Most, if not all, were directed at Muslim centers, mosques, association, organization, government use entrapment cases across the board, and as such began to use this as an avenue. Even though that in 2009, the FBI own study said that the primary domestic threat in the United States comes from white supremacists and white nationalist militias. That is 2009 report with a presentation to Congress and so on. Yet the FBI and our Homeland Security did not actually allocate any resources whatsoever. So when we saw January 6th, oh, where did this come from? The data and the research was there, but everybody was looking for all kinds of so supposedly Muslim sleeper cells in the mosques. There was an attempt to monitor a mosque for supposedly radioactive material, setting up a detecting van outside. They did not even, these individuals who did this from the government did not even have basic science to understand that for you to have a radioactive material and to have a nuclear program, you need facilities that are extensive. You have all kinds, but it works. Another program had what's called a Total Falafel Awareness Program, where they monitored this grocery store, supposedly to try to get mega data to see who's actually, who could identify behavior. It turned out this was an Iranian-owned store, and anyone that knows Iranian cuisine, falafel is not actually one of their items. Right? It turned out many of the hippies in the area were actually are the ones that buy the falafel. So I don't know what's the correlation, but we spend money on that type of programs. The second is the parts of the Zionist movement. In my research, I estimate that early on, 70% of the funding for the Islamophobia industry comes from pro-Israel sources. In particular, the documentaries were all funded by the Clarion Fund, which is a major funding source. The Helen Deller Fund funded Islamophobic organization individuals, including funding European Islamophobes like Dirk Dilder in the Netherlands. They funded the Tea Party patriots, which again, they're racist domestically in the United States, anti-Black, also anti-Jewish, but nevertheless, they received that funding. And I have all this from tax return 990 to identify where this funding. The far right, including the counter-jihad movement that also use this as to launch their political campaigns. The neoconservative right that, especially in promoting the Iraq war, used Islamophobia and then began to build that we're there to liberate Iraqi women. And that actually got a lot of mileage. There are the liberal interventionists that likewise have promoted. I think Bill Maher and Sam Harris represent that strand, never missing an opportunity to be racist and Islamophobe. And then Arab states, especially post-Arab Spring, began to deploy resources both in the US and in Europe, because they want to define that our brand of Islam is the good Islam, and anyone that opposes our policies is basically to be defined as terrorist. And that is increasingly shaping the discourse domestically here in the United States. So I know that we're at 31 minutes, but maybe I want to jump to a few slides and then maybe open to question. And so the America First, what I wanted is to actually look at some of the books that are driving this course is Huntington, Clash of Civilization, Bernard Lewis, What Went Wrong, The Crisis of Islam, and Who Are We? These four books, as well as a couple of others about the replacement theory, inform and give the ideological grounding for people who are using this, that we are defending Western civilization, while in reality, they're actually opening the space for those who were in the margins of the political order in the West to become in the center of driving seats. It's not surprising that the neo-Nazis are actually right now winning elections across Europe using the Muslim subject, which for me actually is also a historical reintroduction, because historically, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia were born out of the same type of ideological epistemology in Western discourse. And as the early part of the 20th century, anti-Semitism led to the Holocaust, Islamophobia today is actually driving toward the same type of death and destruction and violence toward the Muslim subject. Since 1979, from research, close to 12 million Muslims have been killed through the violence that has been committed, whether violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Libya, the Waziristan area, Yemen, and so on, without actually any question asked or actually being intertwined in there. So I will end with this, which is, for me, is one of the most, I don't know, it's what the most out in your face articulation. And I also say that it actually flips Christian theology on its head. This is Huntington in his book, Clash of Civilization, on page 20. He says, there can be no true friends without true enemy. Unless we hate what we are not, we can't love what we are. These are the old truths we are painfully rediscovering after a century and more of sentimental cant. Those who deny them deny their family, their heritage, their culture, their birthright, their very selves. They will not likely be forgiven, right? So basically what Huntington is saying, in order for us in the West to love ourselves, we have to find the object of our hate, right? So hate what we are not, love what we are, and this becomes the way to inform our policy. Now, I know I'm speaking to both individuals who are familiar with Christian theology, which is rooted, one aspect or one pillar of it is love, that God loved the human so much that he sacrificed his own son, and as such, Jesus says, love thy enemy. So those Huntington and others who are positing that they are defending Western civilization are essentially, if Western civilization, one of the pillars of Western civilization is Judeo-Christian tradition, then I would say they're violating the essence of Christian theology. Maybe they thought that they're representing Western civilization as its military-industrial complex, and maybe that's what theology they're prescribing to, and that for me is the clear articulation that we are living in a period where the tradition itself is being flipped upside down to rationalize the current period. So I'll stop in here and take any and all your questions. So we'll have some conversation. Thank you for listening, and look forward to your engagement at this point.
Thank you very much, Professor Bazian. I'm very glad that you and Professor Santiago Slabotsky spoke one after each other, and it highlights how anti-Semitism and Islamophobia do come from the same matrix of coloniality. I think what we're witnessing today, and within the media and with the Islamophobic narrative of what's going on right now in Palestine, Israel, it seems to many going back to 2003. It seems to many we're going back to 1967. My question is, perhaps we've made great strides in tackling coloniality and educating ourselves in Islamophobia, but it doesn't seem like we have done that in a state level. How can we, is there any progress since the works of Edward Said, since the works of others, in trying to change Islamophobic narrative on a state? If not, how do we change it?
Over the past few days and so on, I've been doing press work and talking to the press, specifically because they're talking about I'm the founder of SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, back in 1992, and also founded American Muslim for Palestine, among other groups. The press have taken this notion that is being pushed by pro-Israel, Republican conservatives, evangelicals, at the university has been taken over by decolonial thought, and that critical race theory is the problem, and all these liberal places in the university is what causing this weakness, and we should allow Israel and the United States to use power to determine and to have the outcome. The reality is the following. At the university level, what we call the canon of Eurocentricity is still dominant. It is still the form in the political science, in history, in sociology, in international relations, in philosophy, in religious studies. And places where you have some of this critique, whether using post-colonial theory or challenging colonialism using Frantz Fanon's work and others, it actually is only contained some in ethnic studies and in one or two possible departments based on the individual faculties. And why is this important? Because the main Eurocentric canon of the university informs the individual that end up in policy circles. And for those who witness how the media and politicians immediately in less than 24 hours resorted to some of the most despicable Orientalist, racist, stereotypical material, so much so that the President of the United States uses the White House pulpit to say that he saw pictures of decapitated babies while not actually seeing any of these photos himself, because he was acting from a Islamophobic Orientalist imaginary that every outlandish statement about Arab Muslims can be actually believed. And more so, it reaffirms our already latent Orientalist mindset that has been formed over generations. So we're not even at the academic arena to have material that actually could discuss. I'll say Berkeley, we have 4 faculty, Palestinian faculty members, only 4, right? 2 tenured, 2 non-tenured, out of 3,000 plus faculty members. If you ask me how many faculty will put their name on a really robust statement, I would say maybe 120, maybe 130 on a good day. And that is basically, and then the second, the UC system and Berkeley in particular, will run the 2 major US military labs. So we actually are vested in researching, designing, and promoting death machines as a university. So that you have to make that connection in order for us to understand where we are at, not only for, I would say, Palestine, which is right now is symbolic of this challenge, but also think of the treatment of the Black community. The discussions about George Floyd have shifted from a critique of state power, police training, qualified immunity, to problematizing the Black and saying that the problem is a critical race theory. So rather than the knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 46 seconds being the problem that is institutionally, right, supported, rather than that being the problem, it became that there are people that are pointing out to the long history of racism that informs the system and the structure that we are in.
Thank you. I think that's important to see who narrates what. And
maybe let me add. There's a whole bunch of scholars that supposedly are specialists in decolonial theory. They have not written a word over the past 2 weeks, right? So there's a lot of what you call publishing Monday morning revolutionaries. They'll have decolonization of the whales in the sea, but when it's real decolonial struggle to be talked about, they're completely silent. And I think it's important to understand who gets to be promoted, who gets to be put as the arbiter of decolonial thought, and who is not. And that is part and parcel also of the problem.
Definitely. It seems like the term decolonization has become a trend that can be misappropriated. And I
Absolutely.
guess Edward Said's essay of Permission to Narrate still is very relevant for today. I will read some quick questions from the chat.
Sure.
One says, Professor Hatim, are you exposed to threats from any groups for exposing the truth? Is your post under any danger?
Well, the number of hate mails that come to me, the number of death threats, the number are just, it's nonstop. There are busy days and busy periods and so on. There is constant campaign petitions that takes place, but that's the landscape that you are in. If you're silent, nobody will bother you. Again, I have in a building that most of the building that I am in is the people who are silent. They barely get any what you call visitor for anything. And if you happen to research, saving this and this, you will not be in such an intersectionality. And unfortunately, the administrative infrastructure acts as if it's in a front desk or a desk in the State Department in the US, or at worst, a desk of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Strategic Affairs. So the university leadership is complicit. And that we see right now, the targeting student activists across the country, where universities basically are saying that to protest being pro-Palestine student activists, you are supporting Hamas, and you support Hamas, in essence, you're supporting terrorism. So the framing have created that the students who are supporting Palestinians is the problem, and the administration have across the board, university-wide, have articulated this. Now, Israel has bombed all of the Palestinian universities in Gaza. And this past Sunday on October 5th, they completely destroyed and leveled Al-Azhar University. Not a single US president of a university have uttered a word. Zero. And then they speak about promoting cooperation with Israel. We have so many programs, cooperation program between US universities and Israeli universities. So on the one hand, Palestinian academic institutions are seen as incubators of terrorism, right? While Israeli universities that are complicit in genocide are seen to be an opportunity for upward mobility for many of our presidents. So literally, as we see the destruction that has been visited on Al-Azhar University and other universities in Gaza, utter silence. I was watching a show where they had almost 15 minutes coverage on the trauma that is faced by animals on the Israeli side as a result of the bombardment, the attack on October 7th. 15 minutes, right? Rightly so, again, animals. I said about actually saying that there are 5,000 cats and dogs, meaning Palestinians that died in Gaza, maybe would elicit some type of support, and maybe the president of the university would sign a peace or a petition to actually save the animals in Gaza rather than saving people. We might actually register some sympathy.
Yeah, I saw an article in the Jerusalem Post which recommended people who are eating for comfort on the Israeli side how to lose weight, whilst completely ignoring that there's no food and water in Gaza. I guess this will be the last question. We are running out of time. The question is, how do you explain Islamophobia and the close ties of the USA with countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt?
Oh, very easy. These are post-colonial states. These are elites that we have propped up, facilitated their being empowered. Their economy in a globalized economy are totally controlled by our corporate entities. IMF, World Bank regulate and dominate the region. These are states that do not have popular mandate from their population, so they are dependent on our security blanket and support. Their military security and intelligence is trained by the United States. We have bases all around. We have bases from Egypt that were given to us in the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia has the largest base. And since the discovery of oil, the oil in the region is our oil. That's what sometimes, I disagree with Trump on many things, but sometimes he says he's, an unsophisticated lad. So sometimes he says things that they told him that this is our oil. So he says that this is our oil. And I agree that how we relate to the policy. And the oil returns from Saudi Arabia is to be funneled back into US economy. I often recommend for people to use the Confessions of an Economic Hitman to understand John Perkins, how this post-colonial period, post-World War II is formulated. So Sisi's seat of power is guaranteed by both the United States and Israel. So for his seat of power, those are their criteria. The United States has to say yes to support him, and Israel will not veto his power in order for him to maintain his seat. Saudi royal family, you're talking about a royal family with no popular mandate, no elections, nothing, and they really recycle the oil returns into the US economy. Bechtel had the lion's share. Chevron, which actually used to be Standard Oil of California, controlled the contract for Aramco in Saudi Arabia since from the 1930s all the way until 1989. It's only 1989 where Aramco became a Saudi company. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. So whenever we see a Chevron, right now it's located literally about 30 miles away from Berkeley, headquartered in San Ramon. So all these inform the decision-making that takes place and why, let's say, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the region are still function as political elites beholden to the colonial legacies and post-colonial legacies post-World War II.
Thank you very much, Professor Bazian.
Maybe let me add, for those who were active in the Central American Solidarity period, Central American Solidarity movement, if you recall, when the United States Congress voted to stop funding the Contras and the death squads in Latin America, Reagan administration, and at the time his vice president was George Bush Sr. George Bush was sent to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia actually provided the funding for the Contras as a help to the United States. And the Contras hired the Israeli Mossad and Israeli security to train them in that period. So people need to be aware that often people say, why they are Muslim and they're not helping the Palestinians? I said, it's just, why wasn't that the United States, as a supposedly majority Christians, was not helping the liberation theologians in Latin America to end the death and destruction that has been visited? I think we need to actually look at power, influence, resources, and how these relationships actually set aside any ethical, moral principle. So if Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad were today with us, they would have been marching outside the White House today, rather than being sent as the salesmen and salespeople for Raytheon, McDonnell Douglas, F-16, and so on. But we have transformed our ethics into that type of framing.
Absolutely. I think I just want to say thank you for the brilliant presentation, the important presentation, because I think now that we're going to transition to our action in calling for a ceasefire, we also want to call for a ceasefire for colonial production of knowledge that is providing the moral justification for the deaths of millions. So I think that's really helped. So thank you very much, Professor Bazian.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to go and teach a history class right now, so.
All right. Good luck and يعطيك العافية.
Allah يعافيك. Pleasure. مع السلامة.
Bye-bye. Now we will transition to our Kumi action. We have around 10 minutes or so. We're having a very, very short Kumi action for today. But before Ryan shares the screen and we talk about the Kumi action, On Friday, Sabil is organizing a webinar with various different liberation theologians. And we are preparing it, and we've created an event for Friday at 5 o'clock Palestine time. And if Ryan can put the link in the chat, you can all check and register for the event on Friday if you are available to join. The title of the webinar is Transnational Solidarity Amongst Liberation Theologies, Palestine and Beyond. And we have an array of different liberation theologies trying to cultivate a discourse and how to create more transnational community and resistance. So that's happening on Friday. So please do click the registration link and register for the event. Yes, and for those messaging me, there will be an email with all the different information, but this now is an opportunity to register as well with Ryan's link. With that being said, Ryan, if you can share your screen so we can look at the Kumi actions of this week. So our emphasis is ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. This has to stop. It is really horrific what is going on. So there's two Kumi actions that the Kumi team have decided. The first one is to send an email to António Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Ryan put a draft email that Omar wrote just to thank him and give him support. So that is the first Kumi action of this week. And the second one is to dedicate our time right now to contacting our representatives, contacting different people with positions of power to advocate for a ceasefire for what is going on. So take this time to write both emails in whatever form, or to take a certain action with contacting different organizations, governments, individuals, to sign petitions for ceasefire, to support movements such as Jewish Voice for Peace, AMP, and also putting pressure on those who have not yet spoken out for a ceasefire. So let's dedicate the next 5 to 8 minutes for those actions, and we will end the session. Yes, so thank you everyone for attending today. And if you haven't finished looking at the newsletter or doing your action, you have the Kumi action newsletter that Ryan posted in the chat and on your email. So, you feel free to continue doing your emails and your actions there. Don't forget to register for Friday for the webinar, Transnational Solidarity Amongst Liberation Theologies, Palestine and Beyond. And also, I forgot to mention that for those attending the Thursday service of Sabil, we have a registration link due to security measures. I've sent an email out to all those who attend the Thursday service, but I will send it again tomorrow or the day on Thursday to remind everyone to register as well. And there'll be posts on Facebook if you follow us on Facebook as well. So thank you very much for attending. Hope to see you this Friday and next week, Tuesday. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye, everyone.